in the Civil War when African Americans were emancipated. There was that campaign, but it actually took a long time for most African American and African American men specifically to utilize their right to vote. And then later there were campaigns for women's rights to vote. So usually it was, grassroots movements focusing on specific identity groups.
It's true that the U.S. Constitution did not originally give all Americans the right to vote. Some groups have had to fight for this right. Just after the Civil War, Congress passed the 15th Amendment, giving African American men the right to vote. States, however, soon found ways to block black participation. For example, Southern states held all-white Democratic primaries, and since Republican candidates never won in these states, only the white vote counted. Other impediments included poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses. During the late 1900s, civil rights movements succeeded in overcoming these barriers through challenges in court. Women only won the right to vote in 1920, when Congress passed the 19th Amendment. Yet even though women and minority groups have fought for their right to vote, the percentage of people who actually vote, voter turnout, is quite low.
I mean, I think some people give up that their voice will actually be heard in the process, or maybe they don't like what either side is saying.
Well, because basically, they are the type that's the undecided. They don't know. And they don't want to get into that whole messy voting crap. They don't want to be like, nah, this person voted this person, that person, I don't like this person, I don't like that person. So that's why they choose not to vote.
Americans don't vote for a number of reasons. For one, they feel their vote won't really count. This is called voter apathy. People are also busy, and there are so many choices. There are so many elections, and so many candidates and issues that fill a ballot, that it can be hard to find the time to research to find out who would make a good representative. And some people just don't like the choices. Still, many people do vote, and several factors determine who is more likely to vote. People are more likely to turn out at the polls if they are white, older, more educated, more affluent, and more politically or religiously active.
I'm not sure. Jury's out. I mean, there are countries I know that you are required to vote. If there's a year where there are really bad candidates or an election season, that choosing not to vote is a really great form of protest.
I don't think we should force citizens to vote, but I do think that we should encourage more people to vote and provide more education about the political process and why it's important to vote, why politics matter. Because I think a lot of people don't think that it matters that much in their day-to-day life, but ultimately it does.
Some countries do force citizens to vote, but Americans tend to be individualistic. They believe that people should be free to choose what they do and bear the consequences of their actions. When people don't vote, their voice, values, and interests go unrepresented in government. If groups of people don't vote, like young people or minorities, then their voices are less likely to be heard. So, not voting has consequences for both you and for our democratic system as a whole.
Political participation means voting or campaigning or taking other political actions in order to influence what happens in the political world. About half of eligible voters vote, and most don't vote in every election. Why don't people vote? It takes time and effort to get to the polls, wait in line, and know who and what is on the ballot. These are considered the costs of voting. In the United States, unlike many other democracies, citizens must register to vote before they can cast a ballot. For most citizens, voting requires taking the time to register to vote or to update your registration, travel to the polling place, wait in line, and cast your vote, as well as learning enough about the different candidates and issues to make educated choices. In this picture, a clerk in Missouri checks a driver's license before registering a new voter. The benefits of voting come when chosen candidates are elected. They'll implement policies on tax rates, Social Security, and how tax dollars are spent. For some, the sense of civic duty and the personal satisfaction gained from doing that duty motivate political participation. Time is the main cost of voting. Many Americans apparently find this cost too high because only about half of American citizens vote. Although Americans don't have high voting rates, their participation in other ways matches or exceeds those of other democracies. Historically, it's exceedingly rare that an election is decided by a single vote, yet millions of Americans do vote. The paradox of participation means that people participate in politics even though the impact of their individual vote or contribution would seem far too small to matter. Like the conservative Tea Party, the liberal Occupy Wall Street movement has brought together citizens who want political candidates to pay more attention to their views. Protests sprung up around the country demonstrating against what some perceive to be the inordinate power of the financial sector in the American life and politics. The protests often took the form of extended encampments in public parks. Here, demonstrators in Portland, Oregon, confront police who are attempting to evict them from the park they were occupying. So even if one vote does not make a difference, then why do people vote? Political scientists suggest that people realize that even if participation has a cost, and even if they can benefit without participating, their participation is still necessary. If no one participates, what will happen to democracy? Not wanting democracy to collapse, at least some citizens will decide to participate. Another possibility for why people vote is that individuals think beyond collective benefits to selective benefits. For example, a collective benefit might mean that everyone who wanted a candidate to win can enjoy the victory even if they don't vote. However, a selective benefit could be the satisfaction of fulfilling a civic duty. It doesn't matter to an individual if his or her vote will be the one that determines an election. Just the fact of voting is enough to outweigh the cost of voting. The cost-benefit approach helps us understand why some people participate in politics and why others don't. In a survey of Americans who participate in political activities, 61% said that one of the reasons they vote is the chance to influence government policy. People are more likely to vote when they have enough time to get to the polls or use media sources that help keep them informed. Voter turnout is likely to be higher when the collective benefits are greater and lower when they're smaller. Important elections, such as presidential elections, or when candidates are close on issues, have higher voter turnout than elections in which candidates are running unopposed. A collective benefit is one in which people can share even if they don't participate. Many factors affect individuals' perceptions of the cost and benefits of political participation, and therefore the likelihood that they will participate. The most important personal factor influencing political participation is socioeconomic status, or SES. This is determined by an individual's occupation, income, and level of education. The higher the income level of education and the higher the status of occupation, the higher the SES. Some people who have a high SES are more likely to participate in politics. Their civic skills, such as writing, speaking, analyzing, and organizing, make participation easier for them. A high income makes contributing money to political campaigns easier and may enhance political participation through philanthropic activity or civic organizations where political discussions and participation are common. The most important determining factor of political participation is education. Someone with a college diploma or an advanced degree is nearly twice as likely to vote as someone with less than a high school education. Finally, a strong party identification also influences participation. The stronger the partisanship, the greater the likelihood of voting. Which age group had the lowest turnout? Which had the highest? Why do you think this is? At various points in U.S. history, wealth, gender, race, age, and property ownership all serve as voting qualifications. Voting rights were extended to include women in 1920, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 protected African Americans' right to vote. Today, convicted felons in some states and non-citizens are the only remaining adults who don't have voting rights. The voting process followed in the United States is rare among democracies because it requires 2 steps: registration and casting a ballot. Citizens can now register at motor vehicle offices. In states where citizens can register at the polls on Election Day, turnout tends to be higher. States that allow early voting or make absentee voting by mail easier also tend to see higher turnout. Although some states have laws requiring voters to show approved ID, barriers to voter registration and voting have been lowered. The nature of the candidates' campaigns and issues in an election year can also influence who turns out to vote. For example, the 2008 candidacy of Barack Obama inspired a record number of African Americans to vote. Similarly, candidates with star power, such as Obama and Arnold Schwarzenegger, make elections more interesting and increase voter turnout. When voters care about ballot issues, they tend to vote in higher numbers. Close elections stimulate more intense campaign activity, media coverage, and political discussion, all of which are determining factors that influence turnout. Mobilization efforts are aimed at persuading people to vote, also called GoTV, for Get Out the Vote. These efforts include phone calls, direct mail, and offers to drive people to the polls. Mobilization includes giving people information about the candidates and issues to help them make informed decisions. People learn how to get to the polls or to hearings about issues, which lowers the individual's cost of voting. It brings implicit social rewards for those who agree to participate. Workers gain self-esteem and earn gratitude of other participants. Typically, the mobilization efforts of Democrats and Republicans take different directions based on their respective assumptions about their voters. Democrats focus on people with lower SES, while Republicans focus on suburbanites, church members, and hunters. Most recently, innovative mobilization techniques such as the use of online social media, phone banking, and data mining have significantly added to the influence of socioeconomic status in determining participation. Basing a campaign simply on the aspects of turnout is not often sufficient. A significant element of mobilization requires that the right message be sent to the right people. Several factors may account for low voter turnout rates. In other countries, voter registration is a government responsibility. It's easy. The United States has a personal registration requirement. People have to register, and some don't know how or where to register. If they don't register, and 30% have not, they cannot vote. Most American elections are held on a Tuesday, and people have to work around jobs to get to the polls. Although early and absentee voting has expanded the period in which voting is allowed, early voting has had a small impact on voter turnout. Some suggest that Americans suffer voting fatigue because of the frequency of elections. Possibly, voters become frustrated by America's winner-take-all or plurality system, in which whoever gets the most votes wins and everyone else loses. Not all democracies use this system. Voter turnout in presidential elections declined after 1960, but has shown an upturn in recent years. Midterm election turnout has also declined over the past 40 years. In the 1962 midterm elections, 47% of eligible Americans cast ballots. In the 2010 midterm elections, 41.5% of the eligible population cast a ballot. Electoral choices are determined by a number of factors, including the differences between primary and general elections, partisanship and issues, and policy preferences. Voters tend to analyze their candidates through these determining factors: candidate evaluations, party identification, issue voting. Then they make a voter choice. In primary elections, voters choose candidates who will run in the November elections. But why people vote for a candidate in a primary isn't well known or studied. In a general election, voters cast their ballots overwhelmingly according to party identification. It's clear why they're voting for a Democrat or a Republican. In a primary, voters who are registered as Democrats or Republicans are voting for candidates of that same party. Why do they choose one party candidate over another? Political scientists cannot explain this well. The pioneering study, The American Voter, suggested that most voters adopt a political party that becomes part of their identity. This identification as a Democrat or a Republican tends to be stable over time. It's also the main force in determining political attitudes and behaviors. Party affiliation is an easy way for people to form opinions about issues and candidates. The traditional view of partisanship emphasizes party identification as a factor that determines others' beliefs and behaviors. The revisionist view holds that opinions about issues and candidates can influence party identification. This scale measures direction and strength of partisan affiliation. Partisan affiliation isn't always fixed, especially when extraordinary political events upset existing political arrangements. Possibly, baby boomers entered adulthood with weaker partisan attachments than their parents. Changes do occur, and the swings in recent years are some of the most dramatic that scholars have documented in more than 60 years of tracking partisan attachments. People do switch their party affiliations. White Democrats in the South switched to the Republican Party when civil rights legislation was passed. Some voters followed Ronald Reagan as he moved from the Democratic to the Republican Party. Issue voting means that voters choose candidates based on the candidate's opinions on specific issues. There are other perspectives as well that identify why voters support candidates. One perspective is called prospective voting. Voters judge a candidate based on their assessment of what the candidate will do in office if elected. Conversely, if a candidate has performed well in the past, voters follow the retrospective voting model and re-elect the candidate. If the candidate hasn't performed to the satisfaction of voters, the candidate loses their support. Some issues are easy for voters to develop opinions on, whereas others are more complex, requiring analytical expertise beyond the reach of the vast majority of Americans. Balance issues are those with which virtually everyone agrees. However, voters do have distinct beliefs about which party is better able to deliver on balance issues. Voters evaluate candidates on personality as much as policy. Despite attempts to measure this evaluation, it remains a mystery. Candidate evaluations, party identification, and issue voting are the leading three determinants of voter choice. Is one more important than the other? It's hard to say. Individual decision-making inevitably includes random, idiosyncratic behavior that's hard to identify, and the three elements of voter choice interact in complex ways. As a general rule, a voter will vote for the candidate for whom he or she has the greatest net number of favorable attitudes. If no candidate has such an advantage, the citizen votes consistently with his or her partisan affiliation. Analysis of several demographic categories makes it clear that people who participate in American politics tend to be whiter, older, wealthier, better educated, male, and more conservative than the populace at large, whereas the needs and demands of those demographic categories would appear to differ significantly from one group to the next. Participation is much higher for whites than for other groups. The question of whether political participation matters is important because political participation is different across different demographic groups. Look at these demographic factors linked to political participation. For example, higher levels of political participation are found among whites, men, and those in upper class. Participation is also greater among senior citizens than it is for younger voters. The fact that demographic groups sometimes hold different opinions on policy issues, combined with varying rates of political participation, raises the concern that not all voices and positions get the hearing they deserve. The differences of opinions on important issues are substantial. If African Americans are underrepresented in politics and whites are overrepresented, it can affect the opinions policymakers hear most. This table shows that younger and older Americans vary greatly in their opinions on certain issues. Researchers have compared the opinions of people who actually participate in politics with those who would participate if all groups participated at rates equal to their population percentages, and have determined that it would be difficult for the underrepresented citizens to change collective opinion considerably. As we have noted, the impact of one vote or one person's action is minimal in a general election. Being just one person out of 1,000 in a protest doesn't make a difference. There is this paradox of participation. However, politically speaking, historically speaking, the collective actions of individuals, whether coordinated or not, clearly do have an impact on political outcomes. In 1932, a surge in voter turnout swept FDR into office and continued to support him in his New Deal legislation. In the 2000 presidential election between George Bush and Al Gore, 500 votes made the difference between who won that election. This is an image of shanty towns of the 1930s, as they were called, Hoovervilles, by those frustrated and disappointed with President Hoover's involvement with the relief effort for the Great Depression. The women's suffrage movement began in 1848 with its goal of enfranchising or giving women the right to vote. In their work to abolish slavery and promote better working conditions, health, and education for women and children, women recognized that the franchise was essential. Led by Susan B. Anthony, the suffrage movement grew in size. Successes at state levels increased momentum, and more women joined the fight. It took about 70 years, but women finally were guaranteed the right to vote with the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. This poster advertises a rally for women's suffrage. Women wouldn't get the vote until 1920. In 1963, no federal voting rights protections existed for African Americans. The Civil Rights Movement, a form of mass non-electoral participation, created irresistible pressure on policymakers to guarantee voting rights to African Americans. With those voting rights in place, African Americans have had a major impact on the American political landscape. That concludes our presentation on political participation.